Welcome back to the Horror Academic, and I'm continuing my look at black horror films that, culminating from the my research and looking into Horror Noire, both the book and the documentary. Um, and as a part of Black Lives Matter, I wanted to take a chance to go back and highlight some more of the black films that I did not get to look at originally. So, 1990s horror has been the focus for this month, and I so far they've all been from 95, which I was like, wow, that's a pretty big year, I guess. So today was Death by Temptation, which was 1990. So I was kind of blown away because I didn't, from what I'd read and what I'd heard, I wasn't sure if I was going to like this film. And let me explain that. It was kind of touted as a kind of a callback to religious kind of almost, if you know, like indie comics, like the Chick tracts, these kind of sensationalistic, kind of over the top, lure you into Christianity by telling you all these, horrible things that happen to you if you're sinful. So it kind of had that reference in the book, and it is true. But I was happy to see that the film does not hit you over the head with its religious iconography, and not until the end really does it overpower the story, which I appreciated because I could enjoy this film without feeling this kind of, oh, I don't know, Catholic guilt that I live with. So this guy who's gone to seminary school, and he's kind of preparing for like what's the next stage of life, and I guess now it's time to go out and really become a preacher. So he decides he's going to have one last chance to make sure that's who he really is by checking out what the big city's like. And a friend of his who he knew from college, or he knew from school, kind of vague on his age actually, but he's he's kind of moved out to the big city, New York City, and he's become an actor. So he's really kind of made a mark for himself a bit, and he's kind of put the call out before in the past. And so now he's going to take him up on it and be like, you know what, this will be my last fling to see if, secular life might be the way to go for me. And make sure that I don't need that in my life and I can, go off and become a pastor or whatever. So, a decent premise, right? They're in, I believe they start off in, I want to say North Carolina. And then he travels up to see his buddy in the big city, New York City. The cast is pretty cool because you see some people who are in the 90s in the midst of their career, shall we say, and some who I didn't know of until a little later. But you have, let's see, the character of Kay, played by Kadeem Hardison, who the name didn't really ring a bell until I saw his face, and I was like, oh, that's Dwayne Wayne from a different world, so that's cool. Nice to see him in like a fun indie film. And on top of that, in a flashback to the Joel, he's the seminary guy, his memories and dreams he has of his father, who his parents had died in an accident, and his grandmother pretty much is raising him. But his father's played by a very young Samuel L. Jackson, which is awesome. Always cool to see Samuel L. Jackson show up in a movie. And it was surprisingly young. So I was like, oh, 1990. And then we looked it up because I was like, is this like early in Jackson's career? Because the first thing I could think of was, and I think it's a small part, is True Romance. And looking back, so True Romance, let's see, that's 93. Jurassic Park was also the same year. I didn't realize they were the same year. So, but this, as 90, he did a lot of work. But his film career actually starts in 73, which blew me away. As like an extra, it seems like, on stuff. But still, that's pretty awesome. So, maybe not the height, or, maybe not the start of his career, but right before the movies that kind of I knew him for. So that was neat to see Samuel L. Jackson pretty young. And then the other person that really stuck out to me was the actor Bill Nunn. And I'm looking at him and I'm like, what do I know him from? So yeah, he's been in a couple of Spike Lee films. But then the thing that I'm looking at, and I'm looking through his filmography, and I'm like, no, you know what it is? He's played a cop in a lot of things. He's been in the Spider-Man films, but to me, he was the cop in Sister Act that helped out Whoopi Goldberg. I know that sounds cheesy to reference, but I do like that movie. It's a good movie. The guy who's the lead in the film, the guy who plays Joel here, that's James Bond the Third. And when you look up the film, James Bond the Third comes up quite a bit because he's the writer and the director as well. So I thought that was a nice thing to see, that this was someone with a new project of their own. I can't say he's been in a ton of other films, but I will say right before this, and maybe what he has in common with the other actors I just listed, was that he was in the Spike Lee film School Days. So you almost get the feeling that this is a, hey, I'm going to wrangle up all the guys I met making School Days to have them come work with me on this feature film project that I want to do on my own, which is, that's awesome, because that is exactly what indie filmmaking is. It's resources and it's, networking. So the thing that is very, and I knew this about this film, but I didn't know this was the history of the film, is that it's always been produced and distributed by Troma Pictures. And you know what? We think of Troma as the shticky guys who made Toxic Avenger and my first personal favorite, Sergeant Kabuki Man and YPD. But, for all the schlock, they also were very good at helping get things out there. And it was cool to see that they hopped on this project when it was a new thing. So hats off to Lloyd, Uncle Lloyd out there, Lloyd Kaufman, for getting this film out to the world and helping them finish producing it. So it even has a little thank you in the or a little note in the credits that post-production assisted by the Troma crew. So they definitely were grassroots on this one, which is awesome. Other things about the story, I didn't really get to tell you the rest of the story. So when he comes to the city, so when Joel comes to the city to hang out with his buddy Kay and get a taste of what the city life is like, we see that there is this kind of figure, this woman who's at this bar who every night picks up another guy. And we see the encounters, and she is a succubus. So she is kind of feeding off the libido of these men. Interesting is that this is not, this is a very old, this is like I almost said biblical, but it's a mythological creature, essentially. So the succubus is something that pops up quite often in mythology. So it's interesting to see a different take on it, a modernization of it, using club setting, using like a bar, a bold woman who picks up men, but she also has the ability to kind of switch on a dime and be the kind of coy and mild mannered woman, if that's what she knows that man is looking for. And she so she's the seductress, and it's not taken in this kind of, looking at it as like comparing it to what I've seen in kind of previous incarnations. Even if you think about films that the term that comes to mind is a vamp. And vamp doesn't always mean vampire, right? But sometimes it's interpreted that way. So I almost want to equate this film a little bit to like The Hunger, which is another film that shows a woman as a seductress who's looking to feed, right? Same concept. But how different it can go in these scenarios. Also, it's a decade apart. Not quite, but almost. It's about this kind of almost old school creature that exists in a human form when it wants to and seduces human men, and it breaks down in a very biblical style because it helps tell the story of a guy who's going to become a pastor, that it takes faith and it takes the word of God to strike her down. Yeah, that serves a purpose in the story. And I think they do it well. It didn't bother me, I'm not a religious person, so I didn't feel like offended that, I can watch The Exorcist a million times. It's not going to make me want to be a better Catholic. No, I think it just kind of proves that all of that stuff's messed up. And this film, in some ways, is the same, where I'm like, oh, wow, yeah, it's universal, is I guess what I'm trying to say. One thing, though, is it felt like a callback to the movie Abby, which I reviewed last month, and I really enjoyed, actually, even though it's kind of touted as kind of subpar to the almost, and the term I think that's used in horror noir is silly compared to other films of the 70s that were black horror or blacks in horror. The it's kind of like an Exorcist ripoff. I recommend checking out that review to see if you'd be interested in watching that film. But there's a lot of parallels here that I saw, where in Abby she's possessed, and that makes her this oversexed demon. It's the opposite here, where this is the demon, and this is part of who she is and what her gig is. But there's even in the very end when she goes full on demon, that she looks like the possessed Abby does. And I thought that's kind of cool and that's kind of smart. And I don't know, was it that accessible to film back then? Would it have been known? Would the filmmakers have been influenced by it? I'd like to think so. So I thought it was a better take on it. Overall, my thoughts on Death by Temptation is I was pleasantly surprised that what I thought was going to be an overly religious, overly kind of cliched film about the sins of man and how God is the way to go. Yeah, it was, but it did not hit me over the head with that message to the point that I was uncomfortable with it. I'll say that the victims that we see from the Succubus is, there's a man who's kind of like I think today we would say sexual predator, but I think back then the connotation was just that he was a guy that got around and has a open conversation with a woman about, oh, you're pregnant? All right, we'll just get an abortion. I don't care. So remember, it's Christian film, so that's a bad thing. His connotation of the way he says it is awful, but the idea of abortion, it would be sin enough going by Christian rules. Another guy is he happily married man who then gets lured into having an affair with the demon, or was he willing and she didn't start it? And that's kind of like, so was that his sin or did you make him sin? Interesting. And then, of course, the third victim that we're really shown is a gay man who's trying to be more straight. He's trying to act straight, and she picks up and tells him, be with a woman, and you can tell that he's being punished. Those things are a little over the top. I don't necessarily agree with all that, but in a moral-based story, a story that's going to base itself on Christian morals, these are obvious targets. So, all that being said, I liked the film. I enjoyed it. I thought it was really well done. Characters were good. They felt pretty natural, actually. I think you'd enjoy this film. So I'm going to definitely recommend Death by Temptation. See you there. And that's it from the Horror Academic, and I will see you next time.